From the first spark of life underwater, to the giant beasts of the Stone Age, and finally to man's first upright steps, you have survived much. My thoughts felt like a school of startled tadpoles, scattered and chaotic. I didn't know how much time had passed before they finally started to drift back together. As my consciousness returned, a familiar game narration echoed from somewhere far away, whispering in the dark. It pulled me out of a nightmare. A sharp, stabbing pain hit my head. My entire body felt like it was on fire. It was as if someone had shoved my brain into a blender and then sent me to a crematorium for an early trial run. I let out a low, pained groan. I was frustrated with my body. Sure, I had worked overtime for a few days straight and then pulled an all-nighter playing Civilization, but was a total blackout really necessary? I had been a corporate slave for 5 years, but back in school, I was a top-tier athlete. I shouldn't have been this fragile. I fought through the migraine and forced my eyes open. Immediately, I felt a violent jolting beneath me. My mouth tasted like rusted iron, thick with blood. I struggled to lift my head to see where I was. Cold wind howled past. The road was a mess of deep mud. A long line of wagons stretched out ahead of me, surrounded by refugees in tattered clothes carrying heavy bundles. The air was thick with the braying of donkeys, the wailing of children, and the harsh shouts of drivers. It was a refugee caravan trekking through the freezing cold. I was lying on a donkey cart, covered by a moth-eaten blanket. I was propped up on a pile of luggage and raw animal hides. As the world blurred and shook, all I could see in front of me was a pair of swaying skirts and a very close, very large chest. The jolting was so bad I felt like throwing up. A blonde girl with emerald green eyes was kneeling beside me. She held my head in her lap, cradling me carefully to make sure I didn't choke on the blood leaking from my nose. "You're awake," she cried. She had been watching me closely, and the moment she saw my eyes open, her worried face broke into a bright smile. She leaned over the side of the cart and shouted, "Leo is awake. Leo is finally awake. The bastard's finally up? It's been 3 days. If he didn't wake up soon, I was going to bury him alive." A gruff voice boomed from beside the cart. A pair of calloused, massive hands grabbed the wooden railing. A man wearing a horned helmet and a thick beard popped his head up. He leaned his elbow on the cart to steady himself and used his other hand to roughly grab my head, twisting it side to side to inspect me. "Tisk," he grunted. "I wouldn't be this pale if I'd been dead for 3 days." The donkey pulling us let out a strained bray. The extra weight of the man caused the cart to slow down and tilt dangerously to one side. "Dad, get off," the girl snapped. She shoved the bearded man's head away, saving the cart from flipping over. Then, she turned back to me, gently wiping the blood from my nose and mouth. "It hurts." I groaned again. My brain felt like it was spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. Suddenly, a fragment of memory sparked in my mind. I saw it clearly. Hundreds of kobolds, clutching short spears, swarming down a hillside to ambush the caravan. They looked like golden retrievers standing on 2 legs, but with thicker, more agile limbs. They had the feet of primates, but the claws and fangs of predators. Most were small, about 4 feet tall, but their leader was a massive 5-foot beast. They charged in a chaotic mess, reminding me of a primary school cafeteria rush, but their sheer numbers were terrifying. The caravan had reacted fast. The carts were circled, and the women and children hid behind them. A militia of refugees, armed with crude shields and rusty weapons, stepped forward. Some civilians climbed onto the wagons, firing a few scattered arrows. Many of the militia members were already wrapped in bandages. This wasn't the first attack. As the new militia captain, the original owner of this body, Leo Mondo, had been strangely calm. Kobolds weren't known for their strength or bravery. A trained militia could usually drive them off easily. That's how it had gone the last few times. But this time, something changed. Halfway through the charge, the kobold leader let out a piercing bark. Suddenly, every single kobold threw their short spears at once. A literal rain of sharpened wood blackened the sky. The militia wasn't ready. Men were skewered instantly. Some had shields that shattered under the force. Others had no protection at all. In a single breath, a third of our 50-man unit was wiped out. It would have been worse if the kobolds had better aim or if their leader hadn't signaled to throw too early. The survivors wavered. Seeing their friends pinned to the ground, screaming in agony, the the line began to break. Liao Mondo was furious. He wasn't a strategist, he was all muscle. He screamed at the men to hold the line, grabbed a fallen spear, and hurled it back, impaling a charging kobold through the chest. But it was too late. The monsters were upon us. Kobolds are usually considered weak, but that's compared to professional knights. Compared to starving refugees living on thin soup, they were strong. Years of mining and hunting gave them solid muscle. With their teeth and claws, a single kobold was deadlier than a wild wolf. The militia was just commoners with sickles and axes. Less than half had leather armor. It was a fair fight, which meant it was a bloodbath. The veteran soldiers held their ground, but the panicked recruits were pulled down and torn apart like calves hunted by hyenas. The sound of blood splashing and the screams of the dying shattered what was left of our morale. And the most reckless person there? That was me. I blocked a spear with my shield, split a kobold's skull with one swing of my blade, and dragged a wounded soldier back to safety. But as I looked around and saw my men being slaughtered, I saw red. I roared for the militia to stay in formation, but I did the opposite. I leaped out of the line, straight into the swarm. I slammed my leather-bound wooden shield into a cluster of smaller kobolds, knocking them aside like bowling pins. My eyes were locked on the biggest, meanest one in the pack. This was their leader. He was shorter than me by a head, but his muscles were thick and knotted under his mangy fur. He looked like a pit bull on steroids. Since the ambush began, he was the one barking orders. In the past few raids, he always stayed back, safely out of bowshot. My gut told me one thing: kill the leader, and the rest would break. I lunged. The kobold leader didn't flinch or run like the others. He threw his head back with a savage howl and swung a massive iron flail. The 2-kilogram head of the weapon whistled through the air, carrying terrifying momentum. It smashed into my shield, shattering the wood and leather instantly. My left arm went numb, but I didn't stop. As my shield disintegrated, I drove my blade deep into his soft belly. I ignored the white-hot agony in my left wrist. I twisted the handle, gutting him from the inside. This creature had the build of a gnoll, and unlike his cowardly kin, he didn't care about the pain. He slammed his flail into my chest, then tackled me. We hit the dirt hard. He pinned me down, snapping his jaws at my throat. I twisted my neck at the last second. His fangs missed my jugular but sank deep into my shoulder. I got lucky. My bearskin pauldrons were reinforced with iron mesh. His teeth tore into my muscle, but they couldn't crush the bone or rip the limb off. I went berserk. My left arm was useless, so I used my right hand to keep twisting the knife in his gut. I couldn't push him off, and I wasn't a refined fighter. I did the only thing I could. I leaned in and bit him back. I clamped my teeth onto the thick, muscular cord of his neck and didn't let go. We stayed like that, locked in a bloody embrace, until the world went black from blood loss. The memory was so vivid it made my skin crawl. Now, that memory was turning into real-time agony. Every inch of my body screamed. I used to be a guy who sat at a desk and played video games. I wasn't built for primitive, savage butchery. So, I really bit a kobold to death. This hurts so much I'd rather have died at my desk. I just want to go home. My name is Liao Mondo. I tried to calm my racing heart and shifted my head slightly. Through the blinding dizziness, I sifted through the remaining scraps of the original Liao's memories. This world was a classic Western fantasy setting. Gods, monsters, and a dozen different races. I was in the Olandis Empire, located on the eastern edge of the Dawn continent. It bordered the Orc kingdoms to the north. Centuries ago, the empire was a powerhouse of technology and military might. They united the south and drove the orcs and trolls deep into the northern wastes. But empires fade. Now, Olandis was decaying, carved up by squabbling lords. My home in the northern province was ruled by Grand Duke Mitchell of the Odolov family. As the empire's grip loosened, orc warbands and troll scouts began crossing the North Ice River again, raiding human settlements. My village was right on the front line. We only survived because of Uncle Yulian, a retired veteran who whipped our pathetic militia into shape. But holding out wasn't enough. After a year of blood, Yulian made a bold call. We were leaving. The entire village was migrating 1,000 miles southwest. We were heading to a river bend at the foot of the Red Tail Barrier. Yulian used to be stationed there. He knew the land, knew the local tribes were weak, and most importantly, he had a pioneer's charter from the Frolov family. If we could tame that wilderness and pay our taxes, we'd be recognized as frontier knights. As for the rest of the world, don't ask. The original Liao didn't have room in his brain for history books. He was a simple-minded battle maniac. His mother died giving birth to him, and his father drank himself to death shortly after. He grew up wild. He stole food, picked fights with everyone, and once dragged a half-grown snow bear cub into the village just to feed everyone, nearly getting us all killed when the mother bear came looking. By 15, he was the village bully. Then Uncle Yulian came home and beat him into submission with one hand. Yulian threw him into the militia, and at 17, Liao was more barbarian than man. I felt a slight movement. I was resting against something soft. A blonde girl moved slightly, looking down at me with concern. Olivia. My voice sounded like sandpaper. My mouth tasted like copper and filth. I didn't know if the blood was mine or the kobold's. My left arm was lashed to a wooden splint. My chest felt like it had been hit by a truck, definitely broken ribs. Every time I breathed, it burned. My shoulder was the light injury. The bite marks had already scabbed over. I just hoped kobolds didn't carry rabies. I'm here, Olivia whispered. Her fingers were thin and gentle as she brushed the sweaty blonde hair from my forehead. The kobolds. I croaked. You drove them away, she said, her body trembling slightly at the memory. I only remembered the feeling of my teeth sinking into the kobold leader's throat. But Olivia saw the whole thing from behind the wagon. She told me how that muscular, hulking beast thrashed and clawed at me. It ripped my leather armor to shreds. Blood sprayed everywhere. But my jaw stayed locked on its neck like a steel trap until the life left its body. Nobody expected a handsome, golden-haired teenager like me to be such a relentless brute. The other kobolds didn't stick around. Once they saw their leader's gruesome end, they broke. Within a minute, they left a trail of corpses and vanished into the woods. That was good, so I sifted through the original Liao's memories and nodded, but I couldn't stop worrying. Kobolds are cowards by nature. They only attack when they outnumber their prey at least 2 to 1. This group had dared to ambush a convoy of 300 people with 50 armed militia. That was bold, too bold. The real problem was the state of our convoy. When we started, we had nearly 1,000 people. We had over 100 experienced militia, including veterans like Uncle Yulian. Back then, even the civilians could put up a fight if backed into a corner. But the journey had been long and grueling. Over the last month, anyone with money or a useful trade had peeled off to settle in the safer towns we passed. The 300 people left were the ones who trusted Yulian the most, but they were mostly the old, the weak, and mothers with children. We only had about 100 able-bodied men left. This was the curse of being a non-noble pioneer. We had no family fortune, no official military support, and no legal way to force people to stay. They could leave whenever they wanted. Yulian had mentioned there were several other non-human tribes near the river bend just as dangerous as these kobolds. I wondered if our shrinking team could actually survive. Don't worry, Liao. Just focus on healing, Olivia said, sensing my anxiety. She stroked my forehead gently. My father is here. Yulian can do anything. To the original Liao, Yulian was a god. I forced a smile and nodded, then lapsed into silence. From this moment on, the old Liao was gone. There was only me, Liao Mondo, traveler, kobold slayer, and the new captain of the militia. Don't stop. We're almost there. Yulian's voice boomed across the line, trying to keep spirits high. According to his rough map, we had traveled 1,000 miles south along the World Tree Road. We had finally left the main continent's path at an old watchtower and headed west along the Anzino River. We just had to clear 30 miles of primeval forest to reach our destination at the river bend. We were currently at the westernmost edge of Count Frolov's lands. This was the final stretch into the true wilderness. Those 30 miles were harder than the previous 1,000. Beasts watched us from the shadows, and we had been ambushed by kobolds for times already. The last fight, the one that nearly killed me, had caused more casualties than the first 3 combined. Out of our 50 militia, only half were still fit to fight. Even I, the newly appointed captain, was stuck riding in a wagon, broken and battered. The terrain was a nightmare. There were no roads. Our heavy wagons sank into mud pits. Axle snapped. Donkeys bolted in terror. It rained, it snowed, and fallen trees blocked our path. Even a tiny 3-meter cliff could stall the entire convoy for half a day. People were breaking down. They sobbed in the freezing mud, asking why we couldn't just stop and settle where we were. "We'll be there tomorrow. Just one more day," Julian shouted, standing on a boulder and waving his horned helmet. "There are fish so fat you can grab them with your hands. Deer everywhere. Fertile land for everyone to eat their fill." He had been saying the same thing for weeks. The kids had even turned his tomorrow speech into a nursery rhyme. But his charisma was the only thing keeping this group from falling apart. We had gone too far to turn back. Finally, after a dozen tomorrows, we reached the river bend. It was a massive peninsula formed by centuries of silt. Unlike the dense forests surrounding it, the peninsula was a vast plain of grass and small lakes, with only a few trees on the rolling hills. Even in winter, the withered grass was thigh-high. The soil was incredibly rich. Even a city boy like me could tell this land was perfect for farming. I had been lying in the wagon for 3 days, but I finally managed to stand and hobble around. My mind still felt like a shattered mirror, the original Leo's memories stabbing into my consciousness and merging with my own. It made me act a bit dazed, but luckily, the original Leo was never known for being a deep thinker, so no one noticed. As the wagon stopped on the gravel shore, a wave of relief washed over the crowd, followed quickly by a hollow sense of what now? Julian didn't give them time to mope. He jumped onto a wagon and started barking orders, directing people to cut wood, start fires, and set up camp. The silent, exhausted camp suddenly roared to life. I limped away from the chaos and sat on a large rock by the water. The Anzino River was massive. It started deep in the Great Barrier Mountains and flowed for thousands of miles before emptying into the ice sea. Even here, as a tributary, it was wider than any river I had seen back home. I looked out over the water, feeling the weight of the wilderness pressing in on us. We had made it to our new home, but the real fight was just beginning. The Anzino River was massive. It wasn't like the frozen, wind-blasted rivers further north. This was the mother river of the Northlands, teeming with fish and flowing steady and clear. Here at the river bend, the water slowed down. The channel widened from 50 meters to over 100, looking more like a pristine lake than a river. I could see schools of fish darting through the crystal-clear depths. To the west, snow-capped peaks lined the horizon. Beyond them, a massive cliff face rose straight into the clouds. It looked like the end of the world. That was the Great Barrier, a colossal stone wall that circled the heart of the continent like a giant tree stump. From where I stood, I was only seeing a tiny fraction of it. Dozens of waterfalls spilled from the clouds, crashing down the cliffs in a spectacular display of mist and power. To the north, across the river, lay an endless primeval forest. The trees were giants, their trunks so thick a man couldn't wrap his arms around them. A herd of horned deer, tall as horses, drank from the far bank. A few fawns stared at me with curious eyes. Old Kai told me that the forest used to be a vast grassland called the Wolf Pen. 1,000 years ago, it was the birthplace of the Beastmen's wolf cavalry. Back then, they were the only force that could stand toe-to-toe with the Empire's heavy knights. But when the Beastmen were driven north, their shamans and the elven druids cast a massive spell. The grass turned to forest, burying the ruins of their civilization under a sea of green. Old Kai was a master storyteller. Besides his combat skills, his mouth was his greatest weapon. He could make a pebble sound like a relic of ancient history. "Your tent is ready," a voice snapped. I turned to see Olivia, the blonde girl who had been looking after me. She checked my wounds with a stern face. "Don't go wandering off. If you're tired, go lie down. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, nodding like an obedient kid. The wind picked up, sending a chill straight to my bones. I shivered and headed back to camp to find my tent. It was a small, mismatched thing made of various furs I'd hunted over the years. Most of the pelts were poorly cured and matted from overuse, but in this camp, it was a luxury. At least it was warm. As I approached, I saw a muddy figure huddled against the outside of the tent. It was a child, shivering violently. He had his knees pulled to his chest and a tiny, hole-ridden blanket draped over his shoulders. He was trying to soak up whatever warmth leaked through the furs. I walked up and kicked him right into the tent. Found any food today, little rat? I barked. I felt a pang of guilt immediately. That wasn't me. It was the original Liao. A decade of living like a scavenger, and a thug had carved violence into his very soul. It was a reflex. Luckily, I had pulled the power of the kick at the last second, but the kid still went rolling into the back of the tent. He didn't cry. He just sat up in the pile of furs and shook his head silently. His face was a mask of dull indifference. I called him Little Rat. He was barely 4 feet tall, skeletal, with black hair and black eyes, a rarity in the north. I'd found him 10 days ago under a donkey cart during a snowstorm. He'd been curled up on that same tiny blanket, frozen stiff. For some reason, maybe a buried memory of his own rough childhood, the original Liao had picked him up and tossed him into his tent. He'd shared his breakfast, and the kid had somehow clung to life. Since then, the boy followed the caravan like a shadow. He disappeared during the day and crawled into my tent at night. I didn't have much kindness to give. I was barely eating enough to stay full myself, but I gave him a corner to sleep in. He didn't speak at first, so I called him Little Mute. Once I realized he could talk, I changed it to Little Rat. I had no idea how he survived. He must have been stealing, begging, or eating grass. I stepped into the tent and immediately recoiled. The smell was staggering. It was a cocktail of hair oil, foot rot, and moldy fur. It was worse than a dog kennel. My face twisted in disgust. Even with the original Liao's memories, this was past my limit. I started grabbing the stinking furs and hurling them outside. I dug through the pile until I found 2 snow bear pelts that weren't completely ruined. I tossed the smaller one to the kid. "Follow me," I ordered. He didn't move, so I grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and hauled him toward the river. The noon sun was bright, offering a bit of warmth. I found a spot behind a large rock that blocked the wind and threw the bear pelts into the water. I jumped in and stomped on them. Filthy, oily water bubbled up, slick with grime. It was incredible how much dirt one pelt could hold. I struggled to strip off my own clothes, my injured arm making it difficult. I looked at the kid, who was just standing there staring. "Help me out," I said. He stepped forward and helped me peel off my grimy layers. I stood naked in the shallow water, teeth chattering, and grabbed a rag to scrub my legs. As the black sludge washed away, I felt a wave of relief. My skin was actually pale under all that filth. I couldn't remember the last time this body had seen water. I sat on a flat rock in the river and tossed the rag to the boy. "Scrub my back," I promised. "Do a good job, and I'll give you a piece of black bread." His eyes lit up at the mention of food. He splashed into the water and started scrubbing with everything he had. As he moved, the thick layer of dried mud on his own pants began to dissolve into the stream. For a kid like him, that layer of filth wasn't just dirt. It was his only insulation against the cold. The thin rags that kid was wearing couldn't block the biting wind. I knew exactly what would happen. As soon as we were done, he'd probably find the nearest sun-warmed mud pit and roll in it just to get that layer of insulation back. He scrubbed my back for a few minutes until he was panting, his small arms shaking from the effort. I leaned over the water, catching my reflection. My hair was a matted gold, my face all sharp angles, and my muscles were lean and hard. I had the classic build of a northern barbarian. Even though I was only 17, I was built like a tank. The original owner of this body, Liao, had been a wild one. He was tough, hard-working, and had a nose for food like a bloodhound. No piece of smoked meat in the village was safe from him. He had the woods outside the village rigged with pitfalls. He'd hunted the local rats and rabbits to the point of extinction. He'd eaten so much that the local food chain had basically collapsed, forcing the big predators to move elsewhere. When it came to eating meat, nobody in the village could compete with him. I looked at the kid. He was dripping wet, and black sludge was still oozing off him into the river. I gave him a look of pure disgust. "You're washing too," I barked. "You're pitch black and you stink. The sun is out, so wash your clothes while you're at it." The kid just stood there dazed. "You're a man, aren't you? What are you afraid of the cold for?" I snapped, losing my patience. "Jump in. It's warm once you're under. Get those clothes off, or no bread for you." That did it. He slowly peeled off his rags. Underneath the filth was a yellowed, silk pajama top. When he finally stripped that off, we stood there naked, face to face. It was a hilarious contrast, my bulging muscles versus his bony, bird-like frame. I flexed my arm, showing off my biceps with a grin. I'm telling you, kid, I could take 100 of you at once. I stopped mid-sentence. My jaw dropped. Where's your junk? I scrambled to grab the small snow bear pelt from the bank and wrapped him up tight. Where is it? I demanded. Then it clicked. I felt like an idiot. How could I be that blind? The kid wasn't a boy at all. She just stared at me with those same dull eyes. As I carried her back to the bank, she whispered in a weak, shaky voice, "Do I still get the bread?" I brought her back to the camp and found Olivia. She was busy as usual. I scratched my head, feeling like a clumsy oaf. "Can you heat up a pot of water for me?" I asked. "What for?" Olivia looked at me suspiciously. She leaned in, sniffed the air, and nodded. "You're already clean." "It's for the little girl," I said. "I'm afraid she'll freeze to death if she washes in the river." Olivia let out a sharp huff. "Giving her food, giving her a place to sleep, and now a hot bath? You're certainly serving her well." She turned her head away, acting annoyed, but she reached out and grabbed the girl's hand, leading her toward a tent. The girl clearly knew Olivia. She huddled close to her, trying to show some affection, but Olivia subtly pulled her hand away to keep some distance. The girl didn't seem to mind the cold shoulder. She just followed obediently into the tent. I couldn't exactly follow them in, so I ducked into Uncle Julian's tent instead. As the leader of the caravan, Julian had the largest tent in the camp. It was divided into sections. The inner part was for sleeping, while the outer area had a round table with a map pinned to it by a dagger. A group of men stood around it. Julian was barking out orders, and the caravan heads were listening intently. When a name was called, the man would stand up and shout his agreement. Nobody questioned him. It felt like a military briefing. Julian was a retired imperial soldier. In just 1 year, he had used his experience and grit to win everyone over. He was the undisputed boss of the village. Even from my perspective as a soul from another world, I had to admire him. He was the real deal. When Julian first returned to the village and saw how bad things were, he spent every cent of his savings on grain, recruited a militia, and forged weapons. He built a 50-man force in no time. After a few months of training, he led them to clear out beast dens and hostile tribes, expanding our territory. He even convinced a small merchant caravan to change their route just to trade with us. But our good luck didn't last. Just as the village started to thrive, the beast-kin scouts arrived. After weeks of fighting, the surrounding villages were reduced to ruins. Julian knew staying was suicide. He gathered the refugees, expanded the militia, and used his old army connections to secure a pioneering certificate. He wiped out a wolf den, hunted down a herd of wild cattle for food and pelts, and then burned our village to the ground. He let us out before the enemy could trap us. He'd asked our local Night Lord for help multiple times, but of course, he got nothing. When our caravan of refugees showed up at the Lord's town, the noble blocked the gates, threw us a wagon of birdseed, and told us to rot. We had no choice but to head south, toward the beautiful new home Julian promised. It was a long journey. There were setbacks, fights, and deaths. But in the end, out of the 300 elderly and weak who started this trek, most of us survived. In this era, that was a goddamn miracle. The original Liao was one of Julian's most loyal followers. This wild barbarian only listened to one man. When I walked in, Julian's bearded face cracked a small smile, but it vanished instantly. He glared at me. "Is your wound healed yet?" he barked. "You've been wandering around all day? I've about had it with you." I instinctively ducked my head and clutched my chest, faking a pained expression. "What are you guys planning? We're already here. Why is there still so much to do?" "You don't know squat," Julian grunted, waving me off like a fly. 300 people need to eat, sleep, and poop. Everything is a problem. Go heal up. Once you're fit, I need you scouting the perimeter. We need to know the land. If something needs to be chased off or beaten down, you're doing it. This is our home now. I won't have us getting ambushed." He turned to the man next to me. "Valerie, take some men and tear down the useless wagons. Get a perimeter fence up. Just a few rows for cover on 3 sides for now. We'll build real houses once we're settled." Valerie, a burly man who clearly knew his way around a hammer, nodded and left. "Lashka," Julian continued, "take a crew and burn off the grass on the northern field. We start clearing land for farming tomorrow. Got it, Lashka replied. Rusev, take the militia and scout the area for anything we can sell. Our savings are running thin. Rusev, an older man with graying hair, just nodded. He used to run the village general store and was the only one who regularly traveled to the bigger towns. He knew the world better than the farmers did. He knew what was worth money, and he knew how to get it. Rusev was one of the few who had stayed with us until the end. Most of his family had been slaughtered in a beastkin raid, leaving him with nothing but a young grandson. Like Valerie and Lashka, he was capable, loyal, and had nowhere else to go. We all gathered around a crude map spread across a wooden table. Yulian scratched his chin, his voice booming with a confidence I knew was mostly for show. He told us he had been here before and that the land was rich. He promised that if we put our backs into it and survived the first 6 months, our lives would change forever. He even talked about hiring a survey team to find mineral deposits. He promised we'd all be rich. It didn't work. The people in that tent were the core of our group, and they knew the truth. Unlike the exhausted refugees outside who were just moving like puppets, we knew we were at the end of our rope. We were out of supplies and out of luck. The hardships of the journey were just the appetizer. The real struggle was about to begin. The old Liao would have been swept up by Yulian's speech. He would have been red-faced and cheering, ready to charge into the future. But I wasn't him anymore. I stayed quiet, staring at the map and thinking. Yulian had timed our arrival for late winter. It was a smart move. It kept us away from the massive beastkin raiding parties that moved in the spring, and it gave us a chance to clear the land before the April rye planting. The soil here was fertile, and the weather was warmer than the frozen north. If we had enough hands, we could be self-sufficient in a year. But we only had 300 people left. Most were elderly, women, or children. The families with money and strong workers had already jumped ship, settling in the wealthier villages we'd passed along the way. Only the desperate had stayed under Yulian's protection. Even in a perfect scenario, we had to survive 8 months before the first harvest. Hunting and fishing wouldn't be enough. Most of these people were farmers, not hunters. For 100 years, they had lived under a night lord who owned everything. They didn't even own the right to hunt in the woods. They were so poor they didn't even have the tools for it. Aside from Yulian, I was the only one who knew how to track game, and our homemade bows were useless. We couldn't even take down a deer, let alone the monsters and hostile tribes lurking in the wilderness. What kind of mine are you looking for? I asked, breaking the silence. Yulian waved a hand dismissively. Gold, silver, even copper. Anything. I let out a short, dry laugh. You're dreaming if you think we'll find copper. But how about iron? The room went silent. Everyone stared at me. I walked over to a crate in the corner, pulled out a rusted javelin head, and tossed it onto the table. It clattered loudly. There's your mine, I said. The metal was pitted with holes and covered in a thick layer of rust, but it was unmistakably iron. It was a weapon left behind by the kobolds who had harassed us. Yulian had been collecting them, planning to turn the good ones into weapons and melt the broken ones into farm tools. Iron was precious. The Empire's endless civil wars had consumed every scrap of metal for armor and swords. The prices had skyrocketed. Most of the people in our camp couldn't even afford a basic hoe. I looked at their confused faces and sighed. Where do you think dog-headed kobolds get iron? They don't have shops. They don't trade with the Empire. Yulian slapped his thigh, his eyes lighting up. You're saying the kobolds found a vein? I nodded. It was common sense to me. In the games and stories from my old world, kobolds and mines always went together. I was already thinking about the hard parts, the quality of the ore, the labor needed to dig it out, and how the hell we'd transport it without roads. But the others weren't thinking about logistics. They were staring at me like I had just grown a second head. By the gods, Yulian barked. Liao, did you actually grow a brain? The tent erupted. One man joked that his pigs were smarter than me. Another suggested that the spirit of a kobold I'd killed had possessed me. They laughed about demons and soul possession, making jokes that hit far too close to the truth. I just stared at them. It was amazing how they could figure out I was a different person, but couldn't figure out how to fill their own stomachs. Yulian slammed his hand on the table, silencing the room. The plan changes. We fortify the camp first. Then, we find that kobold nest. We take their mine. Everything else comes second. When the meeting ended and the others filed out, I stayed behind. I frowned at Yulian. What's the point of a mine right now? We can't eat iron. We don't have a blacksmith, and the nearest outpost is 30 miles away through trackless woods. We need food, not ore. I didn't say this in front of the others. I didn't want to kill the only bit of morale they had left. You don't know anything, Yulian grunted, waving me away. Just get your wounds healed. Once you're fit, go find that nest. I'll handle the rest. He wouldn't explain himself. He just shooed me out of the tent. I shook my head and stepped out into the cold air. Inside the tent, the silence grew heavy. Once he was sure everyone was gone, Yulian's confident posture collapsed. He sank into his chair, the mask of the fearless leader sliding off to reveal a face lined with deep, agonizing exhaustion. Olivia, his blonde daughter, stepped inside. She saw him trembling and rushed to his side, kneeling at his feet. Her face was pale with worry as she whispered to him. She gently pulled up his trouser leg. Underneath, his skin was deathly white, mapped with thick, bulging veins that had turned a sickly, rotting black. The rot had spread from Yulian's calf all the way down into his boot. A faint, sickly stench of decay drifted from his leg. He noticed me lingering and quickly pulled his trouser leg down. It's nothing, he grunted, his voice strained. Just a minor scratch. I can handle it. I didn't believe him, but I knew better than to argue with a man that stubborn. I headed back to my small tent. When I arrived, I saw the little rat was already back from her bath. She was struggling to drape a clean snowbear skin over some wooden poles to dry. She had even gathered the ragged furs I'd tossed outside, neatly piling them in the corner. Not a single scrap was missing. She'd even rolled the loose tufts of hair into a little ball to save. She was wearing an old, thick wool sweater with a coarse linen smock over it. Finally, she wasn't shivering. But the clothes Olivia had lent her were way too big. They looked like oversized religious robes, the hem dragging on the ground. She looked ridiculous, stumbling over her own feet, but there was something almost cute about it. This was the first time I'd seen her clean. With the mud washed away, color was finally returning to her face. She had dark hair and dark eyes, with features that were surprisingly delicate. Her skin was a snowy white, far too pale for a commoner. She was still terrifyingly thin, though. Long-term hunger had left her cheeks and eye sockets sunken, giving her a ghostly appearance. Looking at her now, it was obvious she was a girl. The original Liao must have been a complete idiot not to notice. Then again, knowing his personality, he probably wouldn't have cared if she was a different species, let alone a different gender. One day he'd be kind enough to bring a rat home. The next day, if his mood soured, he'd toss it in a pot for stew. I still had her silk undergarment in my hand. It had dried almost instantly after being washed. It felt like holding a tiny, shimmering cloud. Even without unfolding it, the fabric caught the sunlight, reflecting a spectrum of colors. It felt warm to the touch. I'd lived a whole life in a modern world, and I'd never seen silk like this. It was magical. This was clearly the only reason she'd survived the northern winter. It also meant her background was anything but simple. I didn't have the energy to play detective. My main mission was survival. Side quests could wait. Hey, I said, stuffing the silk garment into her hands. Hide this. Wear it underneath. Don't let anyone see it, or they'll steal it. The little rat clutched the silk and stayed silent, keeping her head low. By the way, I asked, where have you been sleeping while I was hurt? She opened her mouth, hesitating. Olivia, sister, built me a tent, she stammered. Her imperial tongue was melodic and pleasant, but her accent wasn't from the north. Since the original Liao had never left his village, I couldn't place where she was from. I was surprised Olivia was being so helpful. She hadn't seemed particularly warm toward the girl. But then I remembered back in the village, Olivia was always the one who cooked the snow rabbits I caught. She often couldn't bring herself to kill them if we had enough food. At one point, she was secretly keeping 7 rabbits and a small deer in her yard. She might be sharp-tongued, but she couldn't stand to see a child freeze to death. The little rat tucked her silk away and suddenly grabbed my hand. She began pulling me toward the center of the camp. The camp was alive with the sound of hammers and saws. People were pitching tents, stripping wood from the wagons, and clearing brush. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been on the road. A perimeter of wooden fences was going up, with tents nestled against them for extra protection against the wind. These fences weren't much, but they'd stop an arrow or a spear. In the center of the clearing sat a large, open-sided tent rigged between two wagons. This was our kitchen. Beneath the wagons, several cages held chickens, ducks, and rabbits, 14 heads and 38 legs in total, our living treasury. A group of village women were busy prepping food, while some younger girls returned from the woods with baskets of wild plants I recognized but couldn't name. The big pots were already boiling. They were filled with wild greens, beans, chopped radishes, and bits of dried meat. The smell of baking bread drifted from the tent. It wasn't fresh dough, though. They were reheating the rock-hard travel rations. Those long loaves were basically clubs. If you didn't heat them up or soak them in hot soup, you'd break a tooth trying to take a bite. To an outsider, it looked like a scene of plenty. Julian had placed the kitchen in the center specifically to create this illusion and keep morale up. But I knew the truth. Those two wagons were the last of our food. The little rat led me to the side of the kitchen wagon where a dozen other kids had gathered. They were all thin, dressed in rags, and looking hopeful. They ignored the girl, but when they saw me, they started shouting, "Big brotherly AO! Captain!" Weirdly, the more he beat them, the more they admired his strength. Still, none of them dared to get as close to me as the little rat did. They knew I might just as easily kick them across the camp. After a moment, Olivia walked over carrying a basket. She looked surprised to see me standing with the kids, but she ignored me. She pulled out a key, unlocked the wagon, and hauled out a bundle of long bread. These loaves were dark and made of mystery grains, but they were well fermented and soft enough for children to eat. She tore them in half and handed them out. Once the bread was gone, she opened her basket. "Listen up," she said, her voice softening. "Everyone gets an extra egg today." The kids cheered. The eggs were tiny, smaller than ping-pong balls. As she handed them out, she gave them a stern look. "The adults are going to be very busy. You stay in the camp. Don't go running off, and don't go near the river to catch fish. If I catch you being naughty, you'll go hungry tomorrow." The camp's chickens barely laid in the winter. We'd only saved up about 10 eggs the whole trip. Olivia had planned to trade them for grain at the last outpost, but since we'd missed it, she decided to give the kids a reward for making it this far. Little Rat had to fend for himself. He usually hid scraps of bread or spent his days scavenging in the wild. Unlike other kids his age, he didn't have to work with his parents, which gave him all day to find food. The problem was that northern winters were brutal. Finding anything edible was nearly impossible. I walked up to him and pinched his cheeks hard. Little Rat flinched, struggling to swallow the unchewed minnow before I could grab it. He curled into a ball, shielding his head, expecting a blow. When he realized it was me, he froze. He looked like a kid caught red-handed, head bowed in shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have given the fish to Dad first." I didn't have the heart to lecture him. I just sighed. "You're too slow at catching fish. Watch me." I started moving heavy stones, quickly clearing a small pool and building a crude stone dam. I left a narrow opening facing the main river current. I clapped the mud off my hands and looked at him. "Let's go. Don't play by the river alone. If Olivia catches you, she'll cut your rations." "What about the fish?" he asked. "They'll be in the trap by tonight. Now move." "And the bread?" He looked up at me with big, hopeful eyes. "You promised yesterday." I had spent all of yesterday pestering Olivia until she finally gave in. She had slipped me a piece of soft white bread under the table. Under Little Rat's worshipful gaze and his repeated cries of "Dad," I pulled the bread out and handed it to him. Breakfast for the rest of us was the usual rock-hard black bread. We only got half the portion we received at dinner, washed down with a large pot of boiling water. It was a northern specialty called antler cassava. It could survive in frozen soil and kept you full longer than bread. The only downside, it was toxic. Eat too much of it, and it would kill you. After choking down the meal, I wiped my mouth and waved over a young man standing nearby. "Juan, get the word out. The militia assembles for training now." A few minutes later, the group gathered. There were only 20 of them. Some were still wrapped in bloody bandages. Able-bodied men were a luxury we didn't have, and the militia members were our primary laborers. They worked all day. Back in our old village, Uncle Julian could only squeeze in training sessions before breakfast or after dinner. I was the only professional soldier who didn't have to farm. The others had originally joined for one reason: Yulian provided an extra pound of bread daily for militia service. In the winter, many poor farmers didn't even have a pound of food for the whole day. But after the long trek here, these men understood the value of being armed. They had seen the wilderness. They knew how fragile life was. Except for the 7 or 8 veterans Yulian had sent to patrol the perimeter, everyone showed up, even the wounded. A year of extra rations and training had made them sturdier than the average villager. They wore thick furs and crude leather armor. Standing there, they looked like a pack of rugged hunters from an old era. We couldn't afford high-intensity physical drills because we didn't have enough food to fuel them. Most of the time, Yulian or the veterans just taught basic weapon handling and formations. These techniques were simple, but they saved lives. Combat isn't like the stories. If you give 2 untrained peasants swords, they might hack at each other 20 times, bleed everywhere, and still both be standing. A trained soldier is different. In a real fight, you only get 1 or 2 chances. Those seconds decide who lives. That's why a crippled veteran can easily take down 5 village thugs. They are faster, and they hit to kill. The previous militia captain had stayed behind during the migration because his family fell ill. Since I was the strongest fighter left, I got the promotion. But I hadn't actually led a session yet. Coming from another world, I had a different philosophy on war. Melee combat was too messy. It was crude. To me, long-range strikes were the only way to go. I had been bitten to death by a kobold once. I wasn't eager to feel teeth in my neck again. My soul was elegant, even if this barbarian body was built for violence. I had a deep resistance to rolling around in the mud with a spear. Unfortunately, my village wasn't a village of hunters. They were just honest farmers. If they were fishermen or woodsmen, they'd already know how to handle themselves. But these guys were tough and strong. I could work with that. I lined them up and cleared my throat. Starting today, we practice javelin throwing. My requirements are simple. 50 yards without hitting the dirt. At 20 yards, you need to hit the target 5 out of 10 times. If you fail, your dinner is cut in half. The men exchanged worried glances. A young man only a couple of years older than me stepped forward. But Captain, what about the clearing? Uncle Yulian said we have to clear 300 mu of wasteland in 3 months. If we don't, we'll miss the April planting. I paused. How big is a mu? They stared at me in disbelief. Then came the looks of pure contempt. Even the illiterate men seemed shocked by my ignorance. I was a village boy. How could I not know the size of a field? I felt the heat rise in my face. How was I supposed to know their measurement system? Was it acres? Hectares? The original Ao never touched a plow in his life, so the memory wasn't there. One of the men started gesturing with his arms to explain the scale. I did the math in my head. 1 mu here was roughly the size of an English acre, about 4,000 square meters, or half a football field. Our farming tech was primitive. We were basically just burning brush and scratching the dirt. But clearing 300 acres in 3 months with 300 refugees, mostly women, children, and elderly, was an insane task. Clearing wild land is nothing like farming a tilled field. You have to burn the weeds, turn the soil, haul away rocks, rip out shrubs, level the ground, and dig irrigation trenches. It takes 10 times the labor of a normal farm. The only reason Yulian was confident was because this peninsula had flat, fertile plains and plenty of water. Further away, across the river, the land was choked by ancient coniferous forests. That kind of terrain was impossible for a group of refugees like us to conquer. For now, we had to make this land bleed for us, or we would starve. I grew up in the countryside back in my old world. Subconsciously, I always thought that if you didn't have to pay taxes, a couple of mu of land would be enough to keep a man full. But this was the remote border of the empire. The farming technology here was primitive, even by this world's standards. The grain we had wasn't some high-yield, lab-grown crop either. In my predecessor's old village, they could only grow rye once a year. You'd sow 200 pounds of seed per acre, and lucky if you harvested 800 pounds back. After setting aside seeds for next year, 1 acre could barely keep a single person from starving. When I did the math, Yulian's demand for 300 mu didn't seem like much at all. Even if we hit that goal, we'd still be far from a comfortable life. 300 acres was over 1,800 mu in my old measurements. Even if someone handed me a tractor, I couldn't plow all that alone. But the original Liao wasn't exactly a man of reason. Knowing the difficulty would only make him frustrated and violent. I decided to use that reputation to my advantage. I don't care about the farming right now. I barked, acting as overbearing as possible. We train first. Anyone who wants to leave gets a beating from me. The militiamen looked at each other in silence. They didn't necessarily respect my youth, but they definitely feared my fists. Besides, the memory of the kobold ambush was still fresh. That rain of javelins had killed 10 of our men instantly. Several others were still rotting in tents, unable to get out of bed. It was the worst ranged attack they had ever faced, second only to the flying axes of the beastkin or the headhunting spears of the trolls. I led them to an empty clearing outside the camp. I measured the distance with my eyes and changed the rules on the fly. Drawing a line in the dirt with my boot, I pointed to a small hillside about 20 meters away. "Start throwing from here," I ordered. "It only counts if you hit a tree trunk." The hillside was dotted with thin trees. Hitting a trunk from 20 meters away wasn't easy. One man stepped forward eagerly, gripped a javelin, and heaved it with all his strength. It wobbled through the air and thudded into the dirt several meters short of the target. The other men burst out laughing. By the end of the first round, the results were pathetic. Only a few javelins even reached the trees. One lucky shot managed to nick the base of a trunk. I wasn't disappointed, though. Back in my world, I was a physical education major. I knew that without training or a running start, this was normal for beginners. I'd seen people throw javelins sideways or skip them across the ground like stones. The javelins we had were a mess. Aside from the ones we scavenged from the kobolds, the rest were just sharpened poles or even pitchforks. They weighed anywhere from half a kilo to 3 kilos. The balance was terrible. Being able to throw these things 20 meters at all showed they had natural talent. "Keep going." I let them throw 2 more rounds. Once they retrieved the weapons, I stepped up to demonstrate. I showed them the proper grip, how to channel power from the legs, the difference between a standing throw and a running start, and the optimal release angle. I held the javelin level over my shoulder. I took a few slow, deliberate steps and let it fly. The javelin traced a perfect, stable arc through the air. It covered the 20 meters effortlessly and slammed into a tree trunk. The tip punched clean through the wood, emerging from the other side. Perfect. Years of athletic training combined with this new, powerful body made my throwing skills hit the ceiling. Even with my lingering injuries, I was a natural. If I were back in my old world, I wouldn't just be an Olympic decathlete. I'd be a god across multiple events. The militiamen were stunned. They started whispering among themselves. Who was the best at throwing javelins? Before today, it might have been the kobold leader we killed. Now, the answer was clearly me. After an hour of training, Yulian walked over from the camp. By then, the men were actually looking like a real unit. They had the basics down. Most of them could hit 30 meters now, though their accuracy was still a disaster. That would only come with time and standardized weapons. "Training's over for this morning," I shouted at the men, who were all rubbing their sore arms. "You barely passed. From now on, we do this for at least an hour every morning." Yulian looked impressed. He slapped me hard on the shoulder. "I didn't know you had this in you, kid." Ow, ow, ow. I ducked away, cringing at the pain in my wounded shoulder. "I picked it up while hunting in the woods," I lied. "Good, very good," Yulian chuckled. "This makes me feel better about dealing with those kobolds." "Don't worry," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "I've got plenty of tricks you haven't seen yet." "Oh, is that so?" Yulian raised a foot as if to kick me. "If you're feeling that good, is your wound healed? If it is, get to the fields and start working." The militiamen didn't even wait to rest. They headed straight for the grasslands north of the camp to join the clearing crews. They were the backbone of this operation. At the end of the day, they were farmers, and land was their lifeblood. Yulian had promised that in the second year, the land would be divided. Every adult male would get 1 acre of permanent, tax-free land. How much they actually received depended on how much they cleared this year. It was a deal you couldn't find anywhere else. In the heart of the empire, the nobility owned everything. Farmers there were either tenants or serfs, owning nothing but the dirt under their fingernails. Only here, on the dangerous fringes, could a man truly own the ground he walked on. I followed Yulian to the site and sat on a rotting stump to watch. Hundreds of people were working in a massive line. They swung hoes, shovels, and pickaxes, turning the blackened, burnt earth over bit by bit. The elderly and children followed behind, hauling away rocks and burning piles of roots. They had already cleared several mu in just one morning. The soil here was softer and more fertile than anyone expected. Watching them work, I felt a strange sense of peace. In the fragmented memories of the original Liao, life had always been a struggle for a handful of grain. But here, looking at the sweat and the turning soil, I saw the beginning of something real. Back in our old village, the ground would still be buried under a foot of snow this time of year. Even the best soil would be frozen solid, requiring a pickaxe just to break the surface. But moving 1,000 miles southwest had changed everything. It was like moving from the Arctic to the temperate zone. The air was warmer, the soil was rich, and the sight of everyone working so hard filled me with a rare sense of hope. But as I watched them, something felt wrong. A realization hit me like a physical blow. I stood up and roared at the top of my lungs. "Where are the donkeys?" The workers paused, looking confused. "What donkeys?" one of them asked. "The ones I saw earlier. The ones the Potavagia kids took out to graze. Why aren't they out here plowing the fields?" My question was met with an immediate explosion of laughter. One villager mocked me openly. "Haha, let a donkey plow a field? Why don't you just ask the donkey to learn magic while you're at it?" I was fuming. I turned to Yulian, who was standing nearby. "Have you people seriously never seen a donkey pull a plow?" I wanted to use the word for a heavy plow, but searching through the original Liao's memories, the concept didn't even exist. I couldn't exactly explain it in my old world's language. Yulian, a man who had spent 10 years in the military traveling the empire, stroked his chin thoughtfully. "I've heard donkeys can work the land," Yulian said slowly. "But it must be incredibly difficult. Maybe it requires some sort of spell." I didn't have the patience to argue. I cursed under my breath and stormed back toward the camp. How could farmers not have a plow? It was a basic tool that had existed since the dawn of civilization. A medieval farmer without a plow was as ridiculous as a modern teenager without a phone. I realized then that if this was the level of technology they were working with, Yulian was incredibly brave, or incredibly insane, to try and settle this wilderness. Back at camp, Olivia tried to stop me, but I ignored her. I grabbed their family's best pointed shovel and snapped the handle, much to her horror. I hacked down a few curved branches the thickness of my wrist, notched them, and nailed them together. I fixed the metal shovel head to the bottom of the wooden frame. In a matter of minutes, I had constructed a crude, simple plow. I looked at the rough contraption and felt a massive surge of pride. 1 week in this world, and I had already brought them the plow. I dragged Olivia and a donkey back to the fields. I hitched the animal to the frame, steadied the handles, and gave a sharp shout. "Move!" The donkey didn't budge. Olivia rolled her eyes, finally catching on to what I was trying to do. She took the reins and led the donkey forward while I pressed the blade into the earth. The soil here was incredibly soft, offering little resistance beyond some dried roots and small pebbles. The donkey barely had to strain. It walked forward, and a deep, straight furrow appeared in the earth behind us. The villagers, who had been ignoring my nonsense, stopped dead in their tracks. To them, I was just a muscle-bound warrior who knew nothing about farming. But when they saw me easily overtake the strongest militiamen in the clearing crew, their jaws dropped. Yulian watched the whole thing, his eyes lighting up with an intensity one hadn't seen before. He even started swearing in the imperial dialect. I've seen this. I knew it looked familiar. The truth was, plows existed in this world, but only in the wealthy southern provinces of the Orantis Empire. Down there, they used heavy 2-wheeled plows pulled by teams of 4 horses. Their crop yields were 3 times higher than anything in the north. That wealth was how they unified the continent and drove the beast kin into the frozen wastes. But the north was different. Here, lords cared about cattle, sheep, furs, and timber. They didn't care about farming. The rye and beans they took from peasants were just used to feed their horses. Most nobles wouldn't even step foot north of the Anzino River, leaving their lands to be managed by distant stewards. Our village had been one of the few natural farming settlements because the soil happened to be decent. Before Yulian returned from the war, most villagers didn't even own an iron hoe, let alone a draft animal. They survived on acorns, mushrooms, and wild tubers from the forest. Without Yulian's leadership, they would have stayed in the old village and waited to die. Yulian immediately saw the potential. He called over the best carpenters, and, under my direction, we whipped together 18 more plows. Every donkey in camp was rounded up and sent to the fields. I sat back down on my rotting stump, satisfied. Watching the villagers work 3 times faster than before, a voice echoed in the back of my mind like a video game notification. Asterisk technology unlocked. Iron plow. Farmer productivity +1. Grain output +1. Asterisk. The design was simple. It didn't have complex parts, just a basic frame that used the ground as a fulcrum. By lifting or pressing the handles, even a child or a woman could control the depth of the furrow. Soon, the men moved off to the heavier work. The clearing was left to the elderly, the women, and the kids. Children led the donkeys, women steered the plows, and the old folks followed behind to pick out the loose stones. The blackened wasteland was turning into brown, fertile farmland at a staggering pace. Meanwhile, Yulian took the men to the western slopes. We weren't just turning dirt anymore, we were building a future. Their next task was to dig a massive irrigation trench, 5 feet deep, to ensure this new home would never go thirsty. The irrigation system was the next priority. We needed to connect the southern marshes and small lakes to the fields. This would help us manage the water levels, keeping the crops from drowning or drying out. The northern part of the peninsula where Yulian settled was flat, making it the best spot for initial clearing, but it wasn't perfect. The terrain had natural dips and rises. Some spots were overgrown with shrubs and sat several meters high, while others were nothing but muddy bogs. The men leveled most of it by hand, but the difficult spots required clever drainage. We also had to think ahead. Before the summer rains hit and the river rose, we'd need to build a small levee along the bank. Without it, the entire peninsula would be underwater. There was a reason this fertile land didn't have trees. Nature had its own way of clearing the slate. I was still recovering from my wounds, so I couldn't join the heavy labor in the fields. But I wasn't idle. While I watched the iron plows turn the soil, I grabbed bundles of hemp fiber from our stores. My body's original owner had spent 10 years living like a barbarian. Those survival skills were hardwired into my muscle memory. I could strip bark and twist it into a rope strong enough to hang a wild boar with my bare eyes closed. But I had something the original AO didn't: modern knowledge. The original guy used brute force, twisting thick, clumsy ropes that needed knots every meter just to stay together. I used a more refined technique. I twisted the fibers into a cord no thicker than a chopstick, yet it was twice as strong as the old man's finger-thick ropes. Soon, I held a finished tool in my hands. It was about a meter long with a small woven pouch in the center. One end had a loop for my finger, and the other ended in a frayed tassel. I slipped the loop over my middle finger, gripped the tassel, and loaded a pebble the size of an egg into the pouch. I began to whirl it. The cord hissed as it gathered speed. With a flick of my wrist, I released the tassel. The stone streaked across the sky, clearing dozens of meters of beach before splashing into the Anz River. The sling. It was an ancient weapon of our ancestors, legendary even in the modern world. I liked the feel of it. I set the first one aside and started on a second. Olivia and the little girl, who I'd started calling Little Mouse, saw what I was doing and came over to help twist the hemp. Olivia was a natural. Her slings looked exactly like mine. Little Mouse, however, produced something that looked more like a mangled centipede. It was crooked and lumpy, but she tried her best. By the time I had 30 slings ready, the sun was beginning to dip. I stood up and called out to the villagers nearby. I told the militia members to follow me to the riverbank. Once they gathered, I handed each man a sling and began the lesson. It's like throwing a spear, I told them. Simple enough for anyone to learn. These slings were far more lethal than the flimsy bows or bone daggers the villagers had made for themselves. Against unarmored enemies like kobolds or goblins, they were devastating. But there was a catch: accuracy. The first few minutes were a disaster. The men couldn't hit the broad side of a barn, let alone a target. Some stones flew straight up, others thudded into the dirt at their feet. Don't use full force, I barked, pacing the line. Gentle swings. Feel the weight. Release when the stone is pointing forward. You. What is that? You're using a rock the size of a melon. Do you think you're a catapult? I kicked a man who was trying to load a boulder into his sling. Under my guidance, most of them finally managed to get their stones into the river. Splashes erupted across the wide water. Of course, there were a few clumsy ones. One stone whistled through the air and smacked me right in the forehead. I saw stars. I clutched the growing lump on my head and stared at the culprit. How did you manage to hit me? I'm 15 meters behind you, and you're facing the other way. I had warned them not to use power, and I'd stayed back for safety, but even a gentle toss from a sling packed a punch. If he had actually swung it hard, I'd be dead. For the next hour, we drilled. Once they could consistently hit the water in front of them, I taught them the vertical spin, the preferred method of ancient Greek slingers. As they got the hang of it, I let them increase the power and the size of the stones. When they started launching egg-sized rocks, the true terror of the weapon emerged. Those stones whistled with a deadly hum. I didn't dare let them use these heavy rocks earlier. One mistake would have meant a broken skull. For the militia, this was the best part of the day. Compared to the back-breaking work of digging trenches, sling practice felt like a game. They were amazed by the power. No man there could throw a rock 50 meters by hand, but with the sling, they did it effortlessly. Even Little Mouse was practicing. Her arms were too weak for the big stones, but her accuracy was terrifying. Every single one of her pebbles landed in the exact same small patch of water. Watching them, I felt a surge of confidence. If I could introduce one small invention a day, I knew I could keep these people alive. As the training wound down, I decided to check on my fish pond upstream. I led Little Mouse to the small pool I'd found that morning. She circled the pond twice, squinting into the clear, shallow water. Then she looked up at me, her eyes blank. "Where are the fish?" she asked. I blinked. "Yeah, where are my fish?" The pond was empty. Not a single minnow. I felt my face heat up under her disappointed gaze. This wasn't how it worked in the movies. I thought for a second, then my eyes landed on Little Mouse. She took a step back, sensing my gaze, but I was faster. I tucked her under my arm and fished a small piece of bread out of her pocket. It was her secret stash for tomorrow's breakfast. She stood there, helplessly wringing her hands, looking like she expected a beating. "Don't worry," I muttered. "I'll pay you back double." I crumbled the bread into fine dust and scattered it across the surface of the pond. "Let's go back and eat. Olivia said there's thick soup tonight. I'll make sure you get a massive bowl." As the sun set, cooking fires began to dip the camp. The scent of smoke and food drifted over the wasteland, and the weary villagers slowly made their way home to the sound of shouting voices and the promise of a warm meal. The camp roared to life as the sun dipped below the horizon. Outside the central kitchen tent, 3 massive iron pots sat over roaring fires. The steam rose in thick clouds, carrying a rich, savory scent that drifted through the cold air. It smelled incredible. I didn't wait for an invitation. I slipped over to Olivia's wagon and borrowed 2 oversized ceramic bowls. Armed with the stolen pottery, I marched straight to the front of the line. The reaction was instant. The villagers nearby scrambled back to give me space. Even the woman holding the serving ladle didn't hesitate. She took one look at me and handed the heavy iron spoon over without a word. The atmosphere had shifted. Usually, these people looked at me with a mix of disgust and annoyance. Now, their eyes held something new. It was a strange blend of suspicion, scrutiny, and genuine awe. "It's Hun Chuan," someone whispered. "That's really him," another voice added. I ignored the chatter. I didn't care about my reputation. I only cared about what was in those pots. I stared into the bubbling broth, swirling the ladle deep to find the best parts. Calling it soup was an understatement. It was more like a thick, hearty porridge. The base was made of hulled grains, but it was packed with salted vegetables, radishes, acorns, and peas. There were even hints of citrus floating in the mix. The real prize was the snow rabbit. A militia scout had caught it earlier that afternoon, and it had been simmering in the pot for hours. The meat was tender, falling off the bone and mingling with the thick grains. Looking at the rich, dark stew, it reminded me of the hearty, rustic meals from a different time. I dug the ladle in deep, determined to get every bit of nourishment I could.